gotten in an orphanage until she forgot her own face. A Lakota chief gave her a name. The deed to my grandfather's land fit in a shirt pocket. I know because I carried it there for 11 years. Folded into a square so small it left a crease in the cloth. And every morning, when I dressed, I would press 2 fingers against it just to confirm it still existed. A piece of paper, 37 acres along the White River, bend where the cottonwoods grew thick enough to break the wind off the plains, and where my grandfather had buried 3 horses and 1 son. The government said the deed was not legal. The government said a great many things. My name is Charging Bear. I am not going to tell you what the agency called me. I buried that name the same year I buried my wife, 1887, and I have not dug either of them up since. I was 51 years old the winter I met the woman who went by the name Margaret Ellen Holt. It was also not her name, and this is the story of how I gave her back what had been taken, and what she gave back to me in the giving of it. Reservation in years was a geography of waiting. Men sat on fence posts and watched the road west as though something was coming down it. Nothing was coming. The agency beef arrived twice a month, stringy cattle that my grandfather would have fed to dogs, and the men who had once run 500 miles of country now stood in a line with tin buckets. I had stopped standing in that line by then. I kept 3 cows of my own and a kitchen garden that fought the alkaline soil every year, and mostly won. I traded smoked meat with the Brûlé families 2 ridges over, and I paid for what I needed, and I asked for nothing. This was what I had become, a man who asked for nothing. I do not say that with pride. I say it because it is true. Truth has a weight you come to know after enough years of carrying it. The agency had a man named Foskett who ran the distribution post. He had small hands and a large ledger, and he wrote everything down in it with a satisfaction that made me think the writing was the whole point, that the beef and the flour were just excuses for the ledger. He did not like me because I did not need him. Men like Foskett require your need the way a fire requires wood. I rode into the post the 2nd Tuesday in November because I needed nails, 16-penny sinkers for the barn repair, 2 pounds of them. That is all I went for. She was standing at the far end of the counter with her back partly turned, and my first thought was that she was one of the Bordeaux women from over near the creek. Mixed-blood families who had been on this land longer than the agency itself. But then she turned, and she was not. She had dark hair cut short, in the manner the mission schools enforced, and she wore a gray wool dress with white collar that had the orphanage cut to it. Not dirty, not torn, just institutional, like something made to fit no particular body. She was perhaps 35. She was holding a list, written on brown paper, and reading it to Foskett, and Foskett was writing in his ledger, and she was saying the words carefully. The way a person speaks a language they learned from books, rather than mouths. Foskett was watching her the way he watched everyone, measuring what they needed so he could decide how much it was going to cost them, in ways the ledger did not record. I bought my nails. I watched him charge her 60 cents for goods that should have run 40. She did not argue. She paid in coins she counted from a small cloth purse, and her hands were steady, and she did not look up. Outside, I loaded the nails into my saddlebag, and I stood there a moment in the cold. The sky was doing what it does in November on the plains, that flat white that is not cloud and not sky, but something between, like the land itself has exhaled and the breath is just hanging there. My horse, a gray mare I called Dust, put her nose against my shoulder. Shh. The woman came out. She had a paper sack of goods, and she was looking at the road as though she was calculating something. Her wagon was a rented thing from the livery in Wakpala, an old Studebaker with a cracked doubletree that had been wrapped in wire. I said, in Lakota, without deciding to, that doubletree will not hold past the Moreau River crossing. She stopped. She looked at me. In Lakota, slowly but clearly, she said, I know. That was the first thing we said to each other. I know. 2 words in the language both of us had been taught to forget. Story came out the way most real stories do. Not all at once, not in order, but in pieces over time. Some told, and some inferred, and some I had to wait years for. She had been born on the Standing Rock Agency, the daughter of a hunk papa woman named Walks Looking, and a French-Canadian trader named something Holt. Trader had gone back east when she was 2. Her mother had died of the spotted in 1864 when she was 4 years old. Presbyterian mission at Fort Yates had taken her in. They called her Margaret. They gave her a last name. They cut her hair and dressed her in gray wool and taught her English and penmanship and how to make white bread. And they told her, in the particular way such places have of telling, that the person she had been before she arrived had not really existed. By the time she was 10, she had nearly stopped dreaming in Lakota. By the time she was 20, she had left the mission, worked as a laundress in 3 different towns, married a named Holt, who drank himself to death in the summer of 1882, worked as a cook in a roadhouse near Mobridge, saved money, and come back. Come back to what? She could not have said clearly. She had come back the way water finds a slope, not because it decides to, but because the ground under it still tilts that way. She was staying in a one-room house she had rented from a Yanktonai family on the east edge of the reservation. She was trying to plant a winter garden. It was November. The garden was not going to happen. I did not learn all of this that first day. I fixed her doubletree with a length of hickory I had in the barn and a rawhide wrap that would hold through spring. And I charged her nothing, and she said thank you in English, and then quietly in Lakota. And I nodded and she drove away. I thought about her for 3 days. Not about her face, though her face was not a thing you forgot easily. I thought about those 2 words. I know. The language sitting in her like an ember in ash, still orange at the center, just needing air. The second time I saw her was at the funeral of an old man named Iron Road, who had no family left, and whose body the agency was going to bury without ceremony. I had heard, and I went. 4 other people were there. She was one of them. She stood at the back, and she did not cry, but she held her hat in both hands, and her knuckles were white. I asked her how she had known Iron Road. She said she hadn't. She said she had heard there was no one coming, and she had decided someone ought to. I looked at her for a moment. She looked back without looking away, which was not a thing many people did with me by that time. I was not a small man, and I had a reputation that had calcified over the years into something people navigated around rather than through. I said, "There is coffee at my place, if you want it," she said. "All right." We rode back in the cold, and I made coffee on the iron stove, and she sat at my table, and we talked for 2 hours first, in English, and then slowly, like 2 people, testing the ice at the edge of a pond, in Lakota. Her Lakota was broken in places and whole in others. Some words she had, some she had lost, some she reached for and could not find. And her face went tight when that happened. A particular tightness I recognized because I had felt it myself. The feeling of reaching for something that was taken from you so long ago. You can no longer tell the difference between forgetting and having been forget. She told me her mother's name, Walks Looking. She said it the way you say a word you have not said aloud in 30 years carefully, like you are checking whether it still means what it meant. I told her I had known a woman by that name. Not well. I had been young. She had lived near the river, and she was said to be able to read the weather in the way horses moved. The woman sitting at my table went very still. She said, "How?" I said. She watched the ears, the angle of them. She said the horses always knew an hour before the clouds came. She put both her hands flat on my table, and she looked at them, and she did not speak for a while. Then she said quietly, "I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about her." I did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. Some losses do not have words that fit them. You can only sit beside them. She came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. I want to be plain about what these visits were, because I have no patience for the kind of story that dresses things up. two people, past the middle of our lives, sitting at a table, drinking bad coffee and talking. She was learning her language back. I was. I did not know yet what I was doing. I knew only that when she was at that table, the house felt different. Not warmer exactly. Heavier, in the good way. The way a thing has weight when it is real. In December, a man named Cutter came to her rented house. He was a land agent out of Pierre, and he had papers. And the papers said that the Yonkth Tonai family she rented from had sold their allotment, and the new owner wanted possession by the first of the year. The papers were probably legal. The law in those years was a tool with a very specific grip, shaped to fit one kind of hand. She came to me on a Tuesday evening with the papers, and she spread them on my table, and she did not ask me anything. She just spread them there and looked at me. I looked at the papers. I read them through twice. Then I said, "How much are you carrying?" She said, $40 and a crate of kitchen goods, I said. There is a room at the back of this house. It has a window that faces south. It is empty. She looked at me. Not a soft look. She was reading me the way her mother had read the horses, looking for what was true underneath. She said, "I am not a charity case," I said. "I know what you are, and I need someone who can read and cipher. My English runs out when the agency letters come, and I am tired of asking Foskett's clerk." That was not a lie. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough of the truth to be worth saying. She moved in on the 28th of December, with 2 trunks and the crate, and a gray cat that was missing half an ear. The cat's name, she told me, was Governor because he ate first and apologized for nothing. There is a particular kind of cold that the plains produce in January that is different from the cold in other places. It is not just the temperature. It is the horizontalness of it. There is no mountain, no hill, nothing vertical to break it. It comes across the ground in a flat sheet like water, and there is nowhere to get above it. You simply have to stand in it and be cold. I had stood in it for 20 years by then. Since my wife died, since my children went to the school in Carlisle that sent back people wearing their faces but moving inside them differently, since the last of my grandfather's cousins passed, and I became the oldest living person who remembered what this land had been before it became a reservation. 20 years of standing in the horizontal cold and simply enduring it. She changed that, not by making it warmer, by standing in it herself, right beside me, without complaint, without pretending it was something other than what it was. The agency letters were the first thing. She read them at the kitchen table, with Governor in her lap and a pencil in her hand, and she translated the bureaucratic fog into plain language with an efficiency that was something close to elegant. This form wants your cattle count. This one is asking if you have filed an inheritance claim on the allotment. This one is important. Read it today. I watched her do this, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was the specific satisfaction of being helped by someone competent. Not pitied, not managed, helped. There is a difference the size of a canyon between those two things. I had a dispute with the agency over my water rights to the river bend. Foskett claimed my grandfather's deed did not include riparian rights. I knew this was wrong because my grandfather had told me exactly what the deed included. But my grandfather was 30 years dead, and Foskett had the ledger. She sat with me for 4 evenings with the deed unfolded between us and an illegal dictionary she had ordered from a bookseller in Bismarck. On the 5th day, she wrote a letter to the Territorial Land Commissioner in Pierre. She wrote it in a formal English I could not have managed. Every argument in it came from me. She was the hand, I was the knowing. On the 4th page, she cited 3 land statutes by number. Foskett backed down in March. He did not like it. He came to tell me so in person, which was the kind of mistake that told you everything you needed to know about Foskett. He stood in my yard and he said, with that small-handed precision he had, that he supposed I had found myself a lawyer. I said, "I found myself someone worth finding." He left. She was standing in the door behind me. I had not known she was there. When I turned, She was looking at me with an expression I did not immediately have a name for. Not pride exactly. Something quieter. Like she was recognizing something she had been looking for without knowing she was looking. Spring came the way. Spring always came on the plains, not gradually but all at once. The snow going in 3 days, and the ground going soft and smelling of iron and the cottonwoods, budding so fast you could almost watch it. I had 30 acres under fence, and I put in oats on 12 of them, and corn on 8, and kept the rest for the horses. She knew cattle. This surprised me, though it should not have. She had spent 3 years on a homestead. She moved through my small herd, reading them the way her mother had read horses. And, when the brindle cow showed milk fever in late April, she treated it with a poultice and 2 days of fever watching that she stayed up for herself, sleeping 2 hours at a time in the barn on a canvas bedroll she'd brought out without asking. I brought her coffee in the barn at 2 in the morning on the second night and found her sitting with her back against the stall door and the cows, head in her lap, and she was singing, very quietly, something in Lakota I did not know, and the cow was still. I stood in the barn door for a moment. Dust put her nose over the top rail and looked at me with that long, calm horse look. That means nothing and everything at once. She saw me, and she stopped singing. I said, "Don't stop." She didn't. I sat down on the other side of the stall door and drank my coffee and listened to her sing in the language she had been made to forget, and was making herself remember. One word at a time, in a barn, in April, on land my grandfather had measured and walked and loved, and that no piece of paper was ever going to fully own. Her name. This is the thing I've been circling toward, and I will come to it plainly. Her name was not Margaret. It was not Holt. The name her mother had given her. Walks Looking had given her a name. Of course she had. She was 4 years old before she was taken. 4 years old is old enough for a name to settle into the grain of you. Had been replaced before she was old enough to fight for it. Replaced so thoroughly and so early that by the time I knew her, she could not remember it. She knew her mother's name. She did not know her own. This troubled her in a way that was not dramatic. She did not weep over it. She mentioned it once. On a May evening, when we were sitting on the porch and the light was going long and gold across the grass, she said it the way you say a plain fact about an old scar. They gave me a name that wasn't mine, and the one that was mine is just gone. And then she went back to shelling beans. I thought about this for a month. I had been the keeper of names in my family since there was no one older left. My grandfather had been a man of substantial standing, and he had given names to children and horses and stretches of river, and I had watched him do it, and I knew what he had known. That a name is not decoration. It is a direction. It is the thing that tells you which way to face. In June, I went to see the oldest woman I knew, a hunkpapa grandmother named Loud Hawk, who was past 80 and who remembered everything. I told her about Walks Looking. I described the woman I knew, the way she moved, the way she read the horses and the cattle, the way she stood in the cold without flinching. I said I was looking for a name that fit. Loud Hawk listened. She drank her tea. She looked out her window for a long time. Then she said, "Stands with the weather." I sat with this. It was right. It was exactly right. The woman who read the sky the way her mother had read horses, who stood in whatever came without softening it, who had weathered 35 years of erasure, and come back to the land anyway, standing in it. I sat with it another week to be sure. Then I went to her. It was a July morning, warm already by 8, the kind of warmth that means a hard afternoon. She was in the garden, which had finally won its argument with the alkaline soil. She'd mended it over 3 with composted ash and river clay, a slow and methodical campaign, and she was tying up the bean plants with strips of cotton, and she didn't hear me come up behind her. I said her name, the name I had for her. Stands with the weather, the Lakota words. She straightened up. She turned. She had dirt on her hands, and her hair was coming loose from where she'd pinned it, and she looked at me with those level eyes. I said, "This is the name that fits you." It came from Loud Hawk. It was your mother's kind of name. A weather name. Ch. I believe she would have given you something like it. She was quiet for a while. The garden was very green around us. Somewhere down the hill my horse was moving in the pasture. That particular sound of a horse moving through grass, hooves, and the soft tearing, she said. You went to Loud Hawk, I said. I did, she said. For me, I said yes. She looked at me for a long time. Then she took 2 steps across the row of beans, and she put both her hands against my chest, flat, the way she'd put them on my table that first winter when I told her about her mother reading horses. Not grabbing, not pulling, just there, feeling something solid, she said, in Lakota. Nobody has gone to any trouble for me in a very long time. I put my hands over hers, just that. The garden smelling of turned earth and green growing things. The sky already hard blue above us. A hawk turning way up there in the heat, I said. You have been going to trouble for yourself your whole life. You did not need me for that, but a name that you cannot give yourself. She closed her eyes. She said the name once quietly, trying it. Stands with the weather, stands. With the weather, it fit. You could hear it fit, the way a well-hung gate settles into its latch. I am going to tell you about 2 more things, and then I will leave the rest where it lives. Is in the private interior of a man's life that does not belong to anyone else's telling. The first is October of that year. The land agent Cutter came back. He came with 2 men this time, both larger than him, and a new set of papers. The papers were a different instrument. They were aimed at my 37 acres directly, claiming an irregularity in the original survey that made the western boundary undefined and therefore subject to renegotiation. This was a lie dressed up in legal language, which is the best dressed kind of lie. He rode into my yard on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was at the fence line, and she was on the porch, reading one of the Bismarck newspapers she ordered, and she stood up when he came through the gate. He did not look at her until he had to. She had written 3 letters in the preceding week to the Territorial Commissioner, the Federal Land Office in Bismarck, and a lawyer named Farwell, in Pierre that Loud Hawk's grandson had recommended. She had copies of all 3, in a file folder she had made from brown paper and cord. She walked off that porch and across the yard, and she put that folder in my hands, and she said to Cutter, in the clearest English I had heard from her, "This property is under federal review. Any attempt to take possession before the review concludes is actionable." I have documented this conversation beginning now. She had a pencil and a small notebook. She wrote the date and the time and the names of the men present. Cutter looked at her, then he looked at me. I said nothing. I did not need to say anything. I stood there with the folder in my hands, and I let her words occupy the air between us. Cutter left. The 2 large men left with him, which is the way large men work when the situation has been turned around on them. They lose their geometry, their reason for being there. She watched them go. Then she turned to me, she said, "Farwell is good. He will handle it," I said. "I know." She nodded and went back to the porch and picked up her newspaper. I stood in the yard a moment longer. The afternoon light was coming in low from the west, cutting across the grass at that angle that makes everything look cut from copper. My land, my grandfather's land. 37 acres of alkaline soil and cottonwood and riverbend that we had held through 20 years of institutional erasure and small-handed ledger men and paperwork designed to wear a man down to nothing. I was not worn down to nothing. I want to say that plainly. Standing in my yard on that October afternoon, with the letter from Farwell in the folder and the land commissioner's acknowledgement in the same folder and her footsteps going back up onto the porch behind me, I was not worn down to nothing. I was something specific. A man on his own land, with a woman beside him who fought my life the same way I would have fought with my body 30 years earlier, who did it without being asked, without performance. Because it was right, because this was her land too now, in every way that mattered. The review concluded in our favor the following February. I have the letter. It is in the same shirt pocket where I once carried the deed. The second thing. A year and a half after she came to live on this land, I asked her a question. I will not reproduce the question here because it was said in Lakota and it belongs in that language and would lose something in translation. She understood it. She was quiet for a long moment. She was looking out the south window in her room, the one that faces toward the river bend. It was evening. The lamp was lit. She said, "You know what I am. You know what I came from and what was done to me and what I've had to build back one piece at a time. You've seen all of that," I said. "Yes," she said. "Most men would look at that and see damage," I said. "I look at it and see what a person is made of." She turned from the window. She looked at me the way she had looked at me in the garden, that level reading look, the one that went to the bottom of things. She said, "Then yes. We have been together 11 years now. The oats come in every year. The corn comes in most years. The brindle cow that she saved with fever watching has calved 4 times. Governor the cat died at the age of 14, which is a long life for a creature with only one fully operational ear. Shh. And she buried him under the cottonwood at the river bend with a proper Lakota prayer that she wrote herself in a language she has now largely reclaimed, word by word, the way you reclaim any country that was taken from you. Slowly, with stubbornness, one piece at a time. My grandfather's deed is still in the shirt pocket. The land is still ours. On winter mornings, when the cold comes in flat off the plains the way it does, I sometimes find her standing on the porch facing into it, not braced against it, just standing. Her hair loose, her eyes on the distance. I stand behind her sometimes. I put my hands on her shoulders, not to hold her. She does not need holding. And she leans back a degree, just that, into my hands, and we stand there together in the weather. Stands with the weather. I know what I gave her back. I also know what she gave me, though she did not set out to give me anything and would dismiss the accounting. Before she came, I was a man enduring. After her, I was a man standing. These are not the same one posture, and every man of a certain age knows the difference. There is no arc to this I can give you. There is only the land, and the morning, and her on the porch, and my hands on her shoulders, and the cold coming in off the plains, and both of us still here. That is enough. That is, if I am honest, everything.